And I wanted to offer a few thoughts on the topic of organizing the federal government for success, which Larry and I are going to talk about, and which just came up in the last panel. And while I promise not to dive too deeply into today's politics, I think it does go without saying that it does matter who's doing the organizing. So it's not an exaggeration to say that this is, I think, going to be quite a consequential election, particularly when it comes to the topic of climate change. Here in California, you've been obviously struggling with an historic drought for years. It's been relieved to some extent this year, but way more to go. In Canada, we've just seen 80,000 people evacuated from Fort McMurray to get out of the path of a monstrous inferno after an incredibly warm and dry winter up there, and temperatures last week of 90 degrees, over 90 degrees. Now we're talking Alberta, not Anaheim. Federal government spending $48 million to resettle America's first climate refugees in Louisiana. It appears that parts of the largest coral reef in the continental United States and the Florida Keys are dissolving because of ocean acidification. Coastal cities up and down the eastern seaboard are experiencing dramatic increases in summer day flooding. So, as everyone in this room knows, climate change is here. It's being driven by human activity. It's happening right now, and it will be catastrophic unless we act ambitiously, and we act now. In 2008, just to dive into the politics for a second, the Republican platform acknowledged the existence of climate change. It pledged support for clean energy solutions, cutting emissions, boosting energy efficiency, and investing in what we now call climate resilience. Their nominee supported cap and trade. 8 years later, the presumptive Republican nominee for president has said that climate change is a Chinese hoax. He told the Washington Post that he is not a great believer in man-made climate change. So I will say it one more time. When thinking about organizing the administration for success on climate change, it matters on who is doing the organizing. So I'm going to speak to you today from the perspective of someone who works for a candidate, who listens to scientists, who takes the evidence seriously, who believes that the climate is in crisis, and who's prepared to use all the tools available to cut emissions, build resilience, and accelerate the transition to a clean energy economy. And I think we need a president who's ready to lead on domestic climate action, to keep pushing the international system, not just to fulfill the promise of the Paris Agreement, but to go further, and who has thought seriously about how to actually get things done, and to get tons out of the system. I want to talk about each of these priorities briefly. On the domestic side, our next president's going to have to defend the progress we've made under President Obama and be ready to use every tool and authority on the books to go further. That means, and David went through that to some extent in his presentation, that means defending and implementing the Clean Power Plan. I disagree with Jim about that, which is tied up in the courts right now. Climate policy is an area that doesn't get talked about as much as it should when people are looking at what I view, and Larry is the expert on the incredible damage being done today by the delay and the lack of consideration for the President's Supreme Court nominee. One of the last official things that Justice Scalia did was to serve as the fifth vote on what was an unprecedented stay of the Clean Power Plan. The fate of virtually every one of the President's executive actions to fight climate change, and therefore the future of our country and our planet, hangs in the balance in the court. So people don't usually think about that as a climate change issue. It's an incredibly important climate change issue. Now, having issued the stay and the administration respecting the court's decision, the Obama administration has still moved forward and found a way to move forward with plans for early incentive programs to encourage states like California to front load more clean energy deployment and to get more tons of carbon out of the system faster. Our next president's going to have to be committed to seeing that early incentive program through, but more importantly, pushing the states to be more ambitious, to be as ambitious as possible in their plans and to go as early as possible. We know the Clean Power Plan isn't the end of the list of the executive actions that the next president needs to consider on climate. We urgently need to do more on methane. Again, I guess that was the first time it came up. From existing oil and gas wells, but also throughout the entire distribution system. There's more work to be done to reform fossil fuel leasing on public lands. We've barely scratched the surface on what we can do to reduce emissions and build up carbon sinks through land use changes and changes in how we manage our oceans. We need to complete the task of phasing down super polluting hydrofluorocarbons through the Montreal Protocol, again, which was mentioned in the last panel. We now have not just to go after the initial chemicals of that were attacked under the Montreal Protocol, but there's now at least a working group to try to use that mechanism to phase down hydrofluorocarbons and replace them with safer chemicals. We need to make U.S. manufacturing and industry as energy efficient and low emission as possible to get more tons, yes, but also to produce more good paying jobs. And there's still room under the Clean Air Act to get more reductions in an even more cost-effective way under the existing authorities of the Clean Air Act. On the international side, there's going to be real diplomatic work to do to be sure that China and India in particular are making progress towards the goals they've committed to in Paris and pushing them again to go further, along with the rest of the world, including the United States. But India in particular has some real internal contradictions. They also have bigger opportunities. They have one of the most ambitious solar goals in the world, and their energy minister really recently said that they're on track to meet that goal. There's some dispute about that, but I think that they at least are committed. The Prime Minister is committed to hitting the goal. But in December of last year, other parts of the government were holding firm to different internal policies that would, for example, double coal output by 2020. And as the U.S. strives not to just meet, but to exceed the goals we set in Paris, our next president should take advantage of our diplomatic and political clout to encourage other countries to go further too. Senator Clinton has proposed a North American climate compact between the United States and Mexico and Canada. So we have a coordinated commitment with our biggest energy trading partners to cut emissions, harmonize efficiency standards, and build an interconnected climate energy grid. That builds on the progress that Prime Minister Trudeau and the President made recently. We know our oceans are under real strain. I think the next president will need to make promoting sustainable stewardship of the global ocean a real priority. And given the rate of Arctic sea ice retreating, the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council through 2017 is an important tool to try to promote cooperation rather than exploitation in the region. Now, I'm sure you've noticed I haven't said much about Congress. I still hold out the hope that Congress will become a real partner with any president when it comes to climate action. But the prospects of that, particularly I think in the House, are in my view still some years off. And this is simply too important to wait for Congress to get with the program. That's why I'm in fact skeptical about absolutism, about about a grand climate fix coming through the Congress. You can hold a lot of fascinating and persuasive economic seminars about what a carefully designed economy-wide carbon pricing scheme could achieve. But I mean this as no disrespect to Secretary Schultz, who I know started the day and who I have enormous admiration for, but it's just not that simple. The Yale Center on Climate Communications asked respondents about 5 proposed measures to combat climate change. A revenue-neutral carbon price was at the bottom of the list, with not even garnering a majority of the American public. So from my perspective, we have to get tons, and we have to accelerate the actions we're taking now. And we have to do that by using the tools that the White House and the president have. Certainly the next president needs to take a hard look at ways that he can work with Congress, or she can work with Congress, to combat climate change, including eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. And you have to be as ambitious and as canny, quite frankly, as possible. But to do that, you need to be able to persuade Congress it's in their interest to play ball. I'd like to see a price on carbon, but I'm more optimistic about persuading Congress to support more investment in clean energy, more investment in energy efficiency, more investment in research and development, because these are things that can create jobs and economic opportunity for their constituents. At the end of the day, we should be prioritizing measures that get more tons in the real world and right away than those that are made theoretically economically efficient or more theoretically economically efficient. Now, the last thing I want to spend just a couple minutes on before Larry and I start a discussion is an area, of course, of personal interest to me, and that's the question of how you make all this change actually happen, how you build the government to support that. I think the experience of the Obama terms can be illustrative. In the first term, we had some real victories, historic investments in clean energy through the Recovery Act, the very ambitious update of the fuel economy standards for automobiles and light trucks. But with those exceptions, and with the exception of responding to crises like BP, the administration really focused on trying to get the big legislative fix to the climate challenge, and as you know, that effort fell short. In the second term, there was more focus on organizing and coordinating the agencies and the White House offices on both the domestic and in the international side of the equation. The president's decision to put out a climate action plan to drive concrete, consolidated programs across the government provided an organizing principle that had been somewhat lacking, in my view, in the first term. The role I ended up playing in the White House and that Brian Deese has now taken over was very different, I think, from what Carol Browner was faced with in the first term, where she spent most of her time really trying to work with the Congress. Brian and I had a blueprint that could be implemented. We had a benchmark against what we could push agencies, and we could push agencies to raise their level of ambition, and we could all be held accountable by the public for enacting the policies that the president had promised when he put out the Climate Action Plan. I think the experience of the Obama administration shows that a successful climate agenda requires a senior, serious point person in the White House who can drive the agencies to do all they can across the full suite of federal authorities, from using federal budgets to drive investment, to using the regulatory levers to drive change, to reaching out to the private sector to get them to raise their level of ambition, to working with the federal science agencies to apply the latest science back to the actions we're taking. There needs to be a plan, and to do all of that, that plan needs to be developed in the transition and in the earliest days of the administration, and there needs to be a person at a senior level in the White House who's responsible for making that happen. I think the president will have some exciting opportunities to take on some of the work that has been pioneered under the Obama administration and to take it further. I'll just mention very quickly two things that I think are just beginning to blossom. First is climate resilience, which President Obama in the Climate Action Plan for the first time really lifted up as a federal matter. There have been some successful initiatives built on part on the recovery and the recovery funds for Hurricane Sandy, but it's still not as mature as the mitigation strategy. Secondly, I think we need a much more robust strategy for having the federal government be a stronger partner with states, with local communities, and with the private sector, because that's so important, and that's where a lot of impactful decisions are taking place. OMB is trying to consolidate the many place-based initiatives that are underway in the Obama administration to get the transportation, the energy, the job programs working together, but government, as Mr. Conton noted, doesn't typically excel at focused, all-in coordination. But it's something that will be important, I think, for the next president to get started on. So I think that The next president will face a tremendous challenge at home and abroad from her first day in office. She'll need to deliver real results for people to make their lives better. She'll need to keep our country safe, and she'll need to bring America together. It's a big challenge, but I think it can be organized and coordinated, and we can build on that success, fulfill the promise of Paris, go further, get more reductions. And with that, I will stop, and we'll have a conversation. Thank you.
But before we start, did David do an introduction?
No.
Aha, so that was that, sorry. Well, fortunately, John Podesta, I think we actually have someone here who needs no introduction, so.
So let's go to it.
So let's just go straight into it. Now, of course, you then covered all of the things that I was gonna ask on, but we'll dig back into them, and I wanna, in particular, touch over the next few minutes on, three big topics, which you did touch on, moving Congress. I think we should spend a little time on that,
Yeah.
on where the best priorities are for administrative action within the executive, and I think we should say a little more on international priorities. But first, I am kind of curious, just especially given all your experience with administrations, how you think the new president should come out of the box on this issue, particularly given all of the other issues that are out there. So do you come out sort of really big? Do you make this your very top priority? Do you come out with a tone of we're just going to continue building on what the Obama administration did, or are we setting a new direction? Sort of what is the best way to position this for real progress coming out of the box?
So I think, and again, 2008 is I think instructive. I raised the Republican platform for a particular reason. There was no real friction on climate change in the 2008 election. Senator Obama, Senator McCain, they had different views. I liked Obama's program a little better than I liked McCain's program, but there was no friction there. There was no debate had. There was no, it wasn't, they weren't challenging each other. This is going to be different. And I think that it is highly likely that, first of all, I think it's highly likely that Secretary Hewlett will be the nominee, but I think it's highly likely that that Trump will be challenged on his views on this question, that he will challenge right back, and there will be a debate about the direction of the country, about where we're going with energy policy, where we're going with the economic policy, where we're going with keeping, as I said, keeping Americans safe. And I think that lays the groundwork, which probably wasn't quite there. We had the opportunity in the Recovery Act. I ran the transition for President-elect Obama, and had the pleasure of first encouraging Steve Chu to enter the administration during the fall of that year. But I think because this will be more of a debated issue, I think you can lift it up at the beginning. She has put out ambitious goals. Senator Sanders has as well, but she's put out ambitious goals, achievable goals. They are very forward-leaning on renewable deployment, on energy efficiency, put a big emphasis on environmental justice. So I think you come out of the gate and you come out big, but the question is, where do you come out? Do you do what, and that's why I referenced the first term and the second term. Do you try to concentrate on working to ensure that the executive authorities you have are implemented so that you can meet those promises you're making to the American people? Or do you start by saying, let's have a meeting of the congressional leadership and see what they can kind of fashion? I would say the former, because I don't think we're going to have I think, again, everybody knows I'm a Democrat. So I think there's some chance that the Senate will have new leadership, a Democratic leadership in the fall, and we'll have Senator McConnell, who's been highly resistant to doing anything, will be at least the minority leader. In the House, I think it's hard to see that changing fundamentally. I think if lightning strikes and there's the possibility of really forging a big agreement with Congress, I'd certainly try to take it. But I think I would concentrate on the Hill with more, what can we get done where we can find some common ground on the investment side, on the clean energy side, et cetera, and not go for a grand attack on an economy-wide program, I'd use the executive action first.
Sure. So let's spend a little more time on Congress, and I'm going to take some issues off
I'll
the
be
table
shorter,
for you
too.
by
I
making some
apologize.
assumptions for you. So these are just assumptions for anybody out there who's listening. First, it only makes sense to have this conversation at all, I think, if the Democrats win the executive branch. I mean, it's just a different conversation if you have a Republican president who doesn't believe in climate change at all. So let's assume we have a Democratic president, and let's just assume, and then you can qualify this as you need, that you've got a Congress in which the Democrats have retaken the Senate, have closed the House, but still don't have the House,
Right.
and in which the Republican majority that's left, although smaller, is probably a little more to the right. That is to say, you've concentrated down on the people who are the most conservatives, are the ones who won. So it makes sense. I understand what you say. You're not going to lead with a grand congressional bargain, but what might a president do? Two things. One is to begin to move towards some kind of congressional action, because I take it you agree at some point you're going to need some kind of congressional
Sure.
action. And then if it's not a grand sort of, economy-wide bargain or a carbon tax that cuts across all economic sectors, what kinds of things might you get out of Congress with more discrete bills?
Well, I think you have to think about the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and then how do we get to deep decarbonization? So I think that on the congressional side, I mentioned a few. I think reinvigorating doubling, tripling the research program on clean energy solutions. I think that'd be a tough sell given the restraint on the discretionary budget. But I think there could be appetite for that amongst Republicans. They hate spending money. They don't necessarily hate spending money on science. So I think that's one place and opportunity. The tax code will almost certainly be a priority for an incoming administration, whoever wins, but it will be one for a Democratic administration to create a fairer tax code. And I think in that context, it opens up some possibilities to reduce fossil fuel subsidies, to kind of support structure, restructure, make permanent, for example, the ITC. If the Republicans keep saying that they think the carbon tax is the way to go, if they want to bring that forward, and what's the trade-off for that? I think our tax priorities are going to be making the tax code fairer, support the middle class, et cetera. So I think with a Democratic administration, there's some levers to play, on the investment side and in the tax code side, but I don't see an administration leading with our highest priorities is we've got to have a carbon tax.
Right. Okay, so then let's talk about what the administration would do from the executive side of things. So you touched on a ton of things up there, of course, and they're all worth touching on, and they're all important. But if you had to list sort of the top priorities, say the top 4 or 5, the most important things that the executive can do in the next administration going forward, what would those be? And also on the side, if there were a couple that are a little less obvious to most of us this is a room filled with people who've been thinking about this a lot.
Yeah.
Are there a couple things that you think maybe aren't getting adequate attention that ought to get higher attention?
Well, I think if you think about it sectorally, there's one of the first things that's going to happen is a midterm review on the CAFE standards that will need to be undertaken to try to keep the program on track to get the reductions that are available in the transportation sector. That's a big one. Obviously, securing the Clean Power Plan and going forward in the power sector. I think that, again, I noted it, I guess David was first to mention, that moving forward, the Obama administration probably will wrap up the methane rules, but only applying to new wells. And there's tremendous amount of gain to be had across both the existing oil and gas production system, but also in the transportation and distribution system. I would put that pretty high on the list in terms of looking for tons. And I think that creating partnerships and commitments and being able to find an organizing mechanism to work with the states that want to go far and want to go fast, the climate leaders, if you will, ought to, I think, occupy the administration. And I'm going to say one more, which is, and I kind of briefly mentioned it, resilience. We just have gotten started on that problem. Hillary's been going and talking about creating a climate war room in the White House. I think she got that idea because she walked back and forth many times in the ground floor of the residence through the war room. I'm sorry, a climate map room. I said war room. I apologize. A climate map room in the White House to be able to see where effects are taking place, to develop strategies, to make it real time, to use the technology that might be available, to kind of imagine what is happening in the natural world and what the impact of that's going to be on the economy and the society. And the reason I tripped up is the map room in the ground floor of the residence is where President Roosevelt conducted World War II. So that gives you some sense of the imagination, the scale of the ambition that one needs to have to be able to think about what's happening in the oceans, on the land, in Alaska, in the Arctic, to be able to vision all the activity that needs to take place in order to prepare the public, the economy, for the challenges that are going to face us.
How do you connect that, or do you see that in tension with mitigation? So is that so you can use that to mobilize mitigation?
Look, I think
it's an easy thing to get everybody on board to do something about it and then distract people from dealing with the longer term problems also, right?
No, I think that was conventional thinking in 2006, right? We got to do both of these things. We got to do them here at home, and we got to do them globally. We got to prepare for what is going to really happen, because the sea is really rising, and infrastructure's under, tremendous pressure. Plus, we have a huge infrastructure challenge on its own of lack of investment, et cetera, et cetera. So we ought to do it smart. We ought to do it for the future that's going to be coming. And we ought to take that as a very, very serious priority. And I don't think it distracts from, I think actually it reinforces the commitment to mitigation. One of the first things I did when I went into work for President Obama is we had the Western governors were in town for the NGA, and they meet as a separate group. We brought them into the Situation Room and talked about both what was happening real time with the Western droughts, but also what the future was going to look like, and how you needed to react to that, build for that, think about the water resources for that. Did that convince them that they needed to do more on mitigation? Probably not, but I think it convinced them that they better take this issue seriously and better get on top of it right away. And I think over the long haul, these things have to work together, because you want to build systems that are resilient, that are efficient. And so I just do not think it distracts. People say, okay, we'll just, we'll build a seawall higher, and therefore we don't have to deal with mitigation. I think they work together, they reinforce each other, and it's important. It's an important part of the public education of what's coming and why we need to do what we need to do.
If done well. I was at a meeting in Miami Beach, and the mayor was really proudly telling us how he'd raised all his roads up, we asked him on what set of assumptions, and, of course it turned out in 20 years he's going to have to raise them again. And of course they've shot their kind of tax wad, so to speak, so it's not clear they'll be able to get well, we'll see. Of course you kick that down the road, as politicians are wont to do. All right, so, and then any sort of less obvious ones that come to mind?
Well, Again, this came up on the last panel. I think there's a tremendous amount to do in it that the discussion of data I wasn't relating to that well, because the way I think about data in the climate space and the federal government is the U.S. government is an enormous generator of important data. And if you can get that into the public sphere and let the private sector, other entities, state and local government and others have access to that data, build apps against that data, I think we could both, I think it'll be it can be an extremely effective tool for planning on both the mitigation and resilience side. We started that in the last several years under OSTP's leadership, but I think there's a lot more to do there.
Yeah, and then the other one I just want to spend a little time on, because you went through it pretty quickly, is the investment question and what the role of the federal government can be in getting the kind of investment we need. So, as you know, I have a slight bias here, which is that the investment we need largely is in infrastructure, hugely expensive infrastructure transformations, whether it's electric grid or, charging stations or solar on a utility scale, just all the, in fact, it's actually across every system. So, how's that going to work? How are we going to do that? Is there, what can the next administration do?
But, this President talked about this today, I think, at his press conference, about the failure to invest. I think that there's a couple things. One is just to commit to being able to raise money and fund an extremely ambitious infrastructure program and try to convince the Congress to do that. The other is to try to leverage private sector money into the infrastructure space. In that sense, energy is a little bit different than roads and bridges, because most of the infrastructure is owned in the private sector. It's not, that there are exceptions to that, obviously, but a lot of the infrastructure is already attracting private sector dollars. But there are ways in which I think the federal government can encourage that. Siting was mentioned. That's one way. I actually not sure what happened to it, so I shouldn't mention it. But we worked very hard to get a fix in New Mexico to get the resources, the tremendous wind resource that was in eastern New Mexico, to be able to cross White Sands and be able to get to the customers in Phoenix and Los Angeles, et cetera. But things like that are really, I think, are quite important.
All right, let's talk a little bit about
infrastructure bank too.
Yeah.
So I think that's another way to leverage federal dollars, potentially federal guarantees, other mechanisms to get more private sector investment in the project of building out ports, roads, and broadband, energy infrastructure. The report, the Energy Department's report on the need for energy infrastructure investments is good. The question is, how do you fund it, and what's the price tag, and can you find mechanisms that will be available to make that money flow into that.
I just got to say, whoever designed this room did a really bad job because there's no clock there. I designed this room, just so you know. Well, not by hand, I know, I just got that. So I want to touch, we only have a couple minutes left, I want to touch quickly on two other things. So
okay.
One is, let's talk about how you organize this out of the White House. You sort of presented a model up there, I think, which was very central command and control out of the White House, one person responsible for the whole thing. And I wonder both whether you think really it's possible to do all of these things as one vertical across the whole federal government, and particularly when you get to the implementation of policies that are made, whether in fact you don't need to decentralize that a lot more, and how do you do that?
Look, I'm like a former White House chief of staff, right? So I have a bias, and I was counselor to President Obama. I have a bias. It doesn't mean that you take over the role of the agencies. It means that you drive the accountability of the agencies. That can only come from the White House. And I think it's better coming directly from the the West Wing than from OMB, quite frankly. The equities are different there, and I think that what we ended up doing was coordinating. I met with all the agencies who had activity under the Climate Action Plan every week, and expected results, and expected that they'd come with newer, bigger, better ideas, both on the communication side as well as but most importantly on the substantive side, and driving accountability, progress. It's just like running any good business. You got to do that, and I think that has to be centralized. The accountability needs to come to a central point, or else it gets scattered, diffuse. You don't keep track of things, and so people thought we wouldn't get the Clean Power Plan out on time, and we did. Because somebody was. We had a pretty good EPA administrator and an Air Act, head of the Air Office, but it took both the political backup and it took drive, and that comes from the president, and he needs someone to help him do that.
Okay, last question, and because we have to touch on the international a little, and I guess to get to the heart of it would be, so you have the post-Paris regime, but if you're the incoming president, is your highest priority moving forward that, or is it continued bilateral negotiations and treaties with the major countries, more China, India, whatever? What should the state priorities be?
Look, I think we got to get the implementing mechanisms and particularly the financial flows working that are embedded now in the Paris Agreement. So that is probably job number one.
Do we have a way to meet our financial obligations on that?
Well, to date we have. Yeah, to date we have. That's always, and they got in the last round of budgets the money that we needed to make available to the Green Climate Fund was there.
Took it out of everybody else's pot.
They found a way to do it without having to label it as such in the negotiations with the Republicans. But so far so good, I guess. But I think that so that's really important work. But I think the bilateral relationships with the big economies and the big emitters is really also very crucial. So Paris wouldn't happen if, in my view, I really believe this. I don't think the agreement in Paris would have happened if the joint announcement between President Xi and President Obama hadn't happened in Beijing a year earlier. So I don't think you can simply separate those things and leave it off to the multilateral negotiators. You have to be engaged. You have to be engaged at the highest level with the president, Secretary of State, in these bilateral relationships, and obviously China, India, Brazil, the EU are critically important because that's where the emissions are.
Yeah, and there too, right?
Indonesia,
Yeah. Right, I would just take a moment to say thank you to John for this. He touched on a lot of things that, of course, he was at the heart very much responsible for making happen. And so in some sense, first, we owe you an incredible thanks and are really happy that you're continuing to be involved in shaping what is, I will say, you can't say this, undoubtedly likely to be the next administration. So thank you very much.
Thank you.